So my fieldwork is based on research in Kraljevo. I do have a map, but I think that will be redundant given the present company. So please, Central Serbia, based on Orthodox Christians. I'm just going to read it out, and we'll take it from there. Eternity and expectation amongst Orthodox Christians in Serbia. There are multiple ways in which ethnographic material on Orthodox Christians in Serbia could respond to the intriguing questions about the future posed by this symposium. But let me start by turning to one Sunday morning in the Kraljevo parish house, just after the liturgy, where people were sitting around drinking coffee and brandy. And I can illustrate. Next one. This quite hazy picture is because of the rakia. I asked two middle-aged men why we rarely discussed Christ's second coming. Having by this point spent considerable time in the field, I had noticed that the last things, or the eschaton, were hardly ever mentioned in conversation. One man, Sasha, responded quickly. Prayer, confession, fasting, he said, before continuing a few seconds later. It's less about talking and more about doing. My other friend, Dusan, recounted a story of how some elderly women had once asked a priest about the signs that would indicate Christ's return. The priest apparently replied by discounting this speculation and emphasizing prayer, and prayer alone, as the only appropriate human response. However spontaneous and off the cuff, these remarks are revelatory, since they reveal some deeper assumptions about eschatological thinking in this context, and the ways in which Orthodox Christians situate themselves in the present. Liturgical life in Kraljevo is not really characterized by explicit futuristic orientation. The focus is more on readying oneself for the end and not being distracted from that essential task by the end itself. What we see in liturgical discourse is an emphasis on eternity, večnost, and an attendant focus on living correctly in this world now. One could say that the perceived proximity of the eternal realm removes some of the urgency of the temporal future. Thus, my basic aim in this paper is to explore how recourse to the eternal allows Orthodox Christians to develop a particular relationship to the present, allowing them to wholly embrace the immediate work of being Orthodox and shun futuristic expectation, but also, in some cases, distance themselves from the present so as to keep things in perspective. In church circles, eternity is seen as coterminous with the presence of God, a dimension which is infinite, timeless, mysterious, and good, and which stands in juxtaposition to the temporal, worldly order. Frequently, references to the eternal serve to draw attention to the transient nature of this world. Keeping the eternal in perspective helps people to grasp that time is precisely that, time. This said, eternity is not a dimension which is chronologically distant, but rather one which is experienced as simultaneous, near at hand, and potentially glimpsable in this world. Faced with the contingencies of everyday life, as well as the perceived injustices and suffering dealt on the Serbian people throughout the 20th century, these Christians are always able to pitch their concerns against this eternal frame of reference. In making such remarks, I do not wish to essentialize or exoticize Orthodox time, suggesting that these Christians live in a secluded bubble paused in eschatological anticipation. Steph Jansen has insisted, despite the prevailing anthropological interest in religious futures, there is a real need to consider secular future orientations, people's mundane, forward-oriented practices. Indeed, whilst my interlocutors strive to be good liturgical subjects, this is not to say that they are isolated from more practical concerns and immediate horizons. Indeed, living in post-Yugoslav Serbia, they inhabit a socio-political context which generates its own ambitions and anxieties, as we have heard a little bit this morning. So just as they are fasting and praying, people make retirement plans, search for paid labor to fund their families, learn languages and apply for visas in the hope of finding better prospects abroad, consider what to study at college, envision where and how to raise a family, and undertake extensive home improvements. what the recourse to eternity does is to allow people to throw all of these future-oriented activities, if only momentarily, into relief. Eternity does not deny the value of activities undertaken in this temporal world, but it can make doing them feel more acute. So, after having provided a little bit more ethnographic context, I will discuss in more detail this Orthodox model of time with a comparison to a Protestant case, and then I will turn to my interlocutors and how they understand their present practice as being situated against the bigger questions of salvation and eternity. And finally, if I have time, I will briefly consider how in instances where historical injustice comes to the fore, the eternal allows Christians to step back from the present, put things in perspective, and see enduring this earthly world for what it actually is. So let me try and situate this a bit better. This paper is based primarily on fieldwork conducted in churches and parishes in and around the central Serbian town of Kraljevo. Despite being a major industrial hub in the Yugoslav period, the town fell on hard times after the collapse of socialism and unemployment rocketed. But the town, with an urban population of around 68,000, boasts a dynamic liturgical scene, with 3 churches, a spiritual centre, a hospital chapel, and 2 kilometres down the road, the famous monastery of Žiča. And I think we have some people gathered together in a church to give you a flavour, and the sort of thing that I was doing most weekends, going to Slava at nearby monasteries. Now, whilst it is frequently observed that the majority of the Serbian population identify as Orthodox Christian, it is also noted that, despite the revitalization of religion in the 1980s and 1990s and the re-emergence of the church into the public sphere, only a slim percentage attend church regularly. This paper discusses Kraljevo's church-going minority, the people who would describe themselves as vernici, or believers, literally. Since the 1980s, the demographic makeup of committed churchgoers has massively diversified, especially in urban areas. I interviewed university graduates, professionals and business people, as well as pensioners, unskilled labourers, and unemployed people. But what this minority have in common is that beyond claiming a nominal Orthodox identity, they seek to lead lives centred on the divine liturgy, lives which encompass regular communion, fasting, prayer, and confession. Whilst for less practicing Serbians, this renewed interest in church-going in the wake of Yugoslav socialism can appear excessive and indeed disingenuous, for such liturgically oriented Christians, a liturgical life represents the path to salvation, a beautiful approach to this world in step with God. Vernici hope to attain eternal life with the Lord, a prospect made possible by the sacrifice and resurrection of Jesus Christ. For them, the liturgy is not a ceremony to be attended occasionally, but a pivot around which spiritual life revolves, the point where humans come closest to God and glimpse the eternal realm. Let me continue then with a very brief overview of some anthropological thinking on different Christian models of time. The anthropologist Juliette de Boulay notes that Orthodox Christianity has been less concerned with mapping time as a linear movement from creation to apocalypse and less troubled by millennial anxieties, suggesting that, and I quote, the liturgical emphasis may seem to be as much on the cyclic as on the forward-moving character of sacred history. Rooted as it is in this temporal world, the Church is inevitably bound to rituals which are cyclic and consecutive rather than simultaneous and eternal. However, an event celebrated at a particular moment of the liturgical year reflects a divine action in eternity. So events in this world are always seen as being simultaneous with those in the eternal realm. It is helpful to consider this Orthodox model of time through ethnographic comparison with an example that initiated many of the debates surrounding the temporality of Christianity, Joel Robbins' analysis of the Urapmin of Papua New Guinea. Surprise, surprise. The Urapmin, converts to Christianity, know that Christ will have undoubtedly returned, although they do not know when. Robbins describes a sloping temporal order in which people are forever pitched forward, placing their best attention on the future and their best energy on their efforts to be ready for that future. For Urapmin, living in a constant state of millennial attentiveness means that almost every action is produced with one eye towards its bearing on the actor's project of salvation. Now, whilst the present becomes an important temporal arena wherein to pursue good Christian lives, it is essentially diminished. It is the future which is symbolically salient and which structures the meaning of things, in Robin's account. In Kraljevo, liturgical time is weighted differently. Vernici know that Christ's second coming is an event on the horizon, though the way it shapes daily expectations and routines is more indirect. The second coming is just not an explicit everyday concern. I'm not proposing, as in Jane Geyer's account of macroeconomic and evangelical time, that Vernici inhabit a temporality split between fantasy futurism and enforced presentism. This is partly because in Kraljevo, the present is not divorced in a chronological sense from eschatological fullness, and also because in their everyday liturgical lives, Vernici do not insist on time as millennial. Elsewhere, writing about Orthodox practice in the Greek city of Piraeus, René Hirschon rightly noted that this present existence and the divine realm are not separated in a temporal sense, but are coexistent. Whilst the Christian narrative of the second coming is just as important here as it is elsewhere, this point on the horizon predominantly works to shape time implicitly, a life lived liturgically, saturated with a wealth of ecclesiastical and fasting practices, inflicted with glimpses of the divine now, removes the messianic urgency of a timeline conceived in linear terms. Let me turn to some real people, and not just anthropologists. This section is called Being Prepared. I spoke at some length about such questions with Ivan, also Ivan, crazy, not the same one, a man in his 40s who works for an insurance company. He was baptized as a baby, though brought up in a fairly non-observant family. Inspired by reading spiritual literature, Ivan began attending church more frequently in his late teens. In one conversation, we chatted about the second coming and what it meant to him. This is not actually Ivan, but it does give you a sense of what it was like in people's homes and the way that orthodoxy percolated into people's homes. In one conversation, we chatted about the second coming and what it meant to him. He explained, "It's not spoken about. It's not a forbidden theme. Everyone knows intimately that it's going to happen, but no one ever knows at which time it will happen. Now, if I constantly think about it, I'll lose my compass. There are other priorities. I need to prepare myself for Christ's coming. If I'm waiting for the coming but not doing anything, I don't get married, I don't make a home, I don't work. I'm just like, okay, we're waiting for Christ's second coming. But you need to make an effort." For Ivan, the inevitability of Christ's return does not imply abandoning everything to wait. Rather, that time should be filled with readying oneself. The anticipated coming sets the tone and the task, though the event itself should not be the focus. Ivan thus elaborated on the importance of being ready, being cleansed of sin, and being upstanding. In contrast with the Scottish Protestants studied by Joseph Webster, for whom scanning the future for signs was an essential part of their eschatological experience, Vernici and Kraljevo eschew this sort of speculation. Ivan downplays projection and emphasizes a sort of self-oriented, non-speculative ever-readiness. One quotation that circulated on a social media group dedicated to Orthodox writings stated, and I quote, "If God had wanted us to know the future, he would have revealed it to us." Of course, Ivan's explanation, "be ready," and Sasha's initial riposte, with which I started, "less talking, more doing," are a particular mode of eschatological thought, insofar as they are all premised on that which is to come. However, rather than ascribing value to the place between now and then, they completely absorb the futuristic element in the act of being prepared. At this point, let me briefly turn to another interlocutor, Jovana, a lively woman in her mid-20s, a secondary school teacher, who I met at church. She was slightly taken aback when I asked her whether she'd ever contemplated the second coming. "No, I have never thought about it," she said. Of course, as a vernik, it means something to me to think of him, of Jesus Christ, but I don't need to talk about it. Maybe I have more of a need to talk about some general things, about fasting, for instance. Perhaps someone who had been going to church longer, an older person, might have opted to be less candid or offered a more assured theological response. But with her honest and initially bemused answer, Jovana makes a crucial point. My question about the second coming was perhaps stimulating academically. Jovana said that she would think about it some more, that it was a very interesting point. But it certainly failed to identify what makes liturgical practice compelling. A meaningful liturgical life can exist independently of abstract discussion about salvation. It is an implicit and not explicit goal. Jovana said that she would rather talk about fasting. This is significant because arguably fasting is in and for itself an eschatological engagement. It is the work of salvation subsumed in practice. The importance of fasting was exemplified quite clearly when I was invited to a pig slaughter, or svinjokol, on the 8th of December. This is a key picture. The date is significant since it falls after the 28th of November, which is always the beginning of the Nativity fast, leading up to Christmas on the 7th of January. During this time, committed Christians forego meat and dairy products. The people who had invited me, whilst identifying as Orthodox, rarely attended the liturgy and fasted as and when it suited them. And when I arrived, I was served with meat and cheese, which, of course, if you were going to a very sort of the house of vernik, that would never, ever happen, categorically. But you notice here the interesting blend of the icons on the wall, but observing their own fasting rhythm. So this was very much the nativity fast, but they ignored the fasting moment. My interlocutors from church reacted gravely when I told them where I was going. It is common knowledge that as well as the practical business of butchering the pig, a good svinjokol always involves drinking and the consumption of pork products. This would mean breaking the fast, and this is why, in theory, pig slaughtering should be completed before the end of November. And as any more proof were needed that this was not really a fasting atmosphere, we just saw the meat being wielded around. When I later described the situation to Anna, a very regular churchgoer in her 50s, she ruefully reflected on the situation. That svinjokol during the fast will destroy us Serbs. In enjoyment, you forget spiritual principles. Spiritual principles always come after bodily ones, i.e. it should be vice versa, in her opinion. The body comes first, and then the spiritual. Enjoyment in food, enjoyment in fashion, but this is all a lie. We live for this worldly life. We forget that view on eternity. Here, the very idea of svinjokol during a fasting period leads Anna to elaborate on Orthodox assumptions about this world and its heavenly counterpart, and how overindulgence in enjoyment clouds a person's view of the eternal. In her view, the nativity fast is a time for restraint, reflection, and prayer, not for the merriment and excess that comes with slaughtering pigs. It is a hell of a lot of fun, but I didn't let on. There is, of course, an important idea implicit in Anna's thoughts. If a person does restrain themselves from enjoyment, then they could potentially gain a glimpse of the eternal. In the Orthodox view, people are not irreversibly shackled to a worldly life, and they have the capacities and freedom to step beyond it. So whilst this world is defined against God's eternity, that eternity is also potentially reachable here and now. In the words of the theologian Kallistos Ware, whenever consciously or unconsciously we choose the good, we enter by anticipation into eternal life. There are thus important temporal ramifications that stem from this understanding of a person's relationship to God. Saturated as it is with moral striving, ritual practice, and rich spiritual experience, the liturgical day-to-day does not need an abstract sequential future to imbue it with meaning. To play with Joel Robbins' metaphor, it might be better to say that Vernici and Kraljevo are not so much pitched forward as pitched inward, focused on honing their relationship with God. And in the final section, I just called it Looking to the End, and I want to have a look at the way recourse to the eternal produced a different sort of relationship to the present. However, I do not want to suggest that my interlocutors, for all of their talk of remaining focused on the present, had no sense of eschatological time. They certainly do. This appears flagrantly when they discuss divine justice and final judgment. Given Serbia's turbulent 20th century and the injustice and suffering which my interlocutors understand their people as having faced, such excursions to the end of time, to quote Charles Stewart, are not infrequent. But my point here, again, will be that rather than pitch these Christians to the future with a sort of messianic expectation, such reference to the eternal works to recalibrate their relationship to the present. It reasserts the fact that this world is merely transient and temporal, and that there is a more hopeful world beyond it. Let me give one example. Perfect. In September 2017, a coach trip was organised to the Serbian Orthodox monastery of Devic in northern Kosovo. And here we are, and I think, is it the first? Yes, so this is key for the next point. Originally built in 1434, it was first pulled down during the Ottoman period, but consequently reconstructed. In 1941, during the Second World War, the monastery was torched by Albanian forces. In 1999, the Kosovo Liberation Army vandalized the monastery and desecrated the tomb of the patron saint. During the unrest of 2004, after the nuns had been evacuated for their own safety, the monastery was again set ablaze. Hence the slight military protection. You have to go through various barriers on the way. On the day of our visit, an elderly nun recounted the history of the place, standing near a tomb in the nave. Her voice was almost breaking as she drew her thoughts together. But what can we do? Wait for the end, and then we will have won. God will judge them. God will judge us all. This episode recalled another conversation with a monk whom I met through a mutual friend. The fact that I was born in England was, by his own frank admission, displeasing for him, and led to him giving an extended critique of the international community's attempt to fabricate Serbian guilt so as to bomb and then acquire resource-rich Kosovo. He eventually trailed off, but then added, musingly and with resignation, "But okay, it's not important. Worldly justice isn't effective, but heavenly justice will be." He pointed upwards with his finger. In both accounts, there is a clear sense of history leading to an end, an eschatological focus. But what struck me was not the urgent tone of the speakers or their eager anticipation, but rather their resignation. The nun emphasizes enduring through the here and now, waiting. The monk points to a split between worldly justice and the divine version. Having the eternal as a gauge, a dimension characterized by fullness, peace, and the presence of the Lord, renders this world fleeting and passing. This does not work to deny historical change or isolate people from it. Rather, it identifies historical change as historical, as something happening in time. It throws temporal existence with all its suffering, uncertainty, deceit, and discomfort into relief. In relating to troubling events through invoking divine justice and final judgment, some Orthodox Christians subvert more formalized processes of facing the past and contend with them in holistic cosmological terms. As the Serbian philosopher Bogoljub Šijaković has written in his book on Orthodox transcendence, the eschaton is potentially present in each historical moment as the measure of its meaning. All worldly temporal existence can be held up against the relief of eternity, putting one's place in the present into perspective. So in conclusion, within the massive social transformations that marked the end of Serbia's 20th century, Orthodox Christianity re-emerged into the public sphere. For many people, this represented a newly credible expression of Serbianness, a national or ethnic confessional identity. For some, however, the liturgical practice of orthodoxy became a way through which they quite profoundly reoriented their relationships to themselves, to others, and to the cosmos. What I have attempted to show here is that rather than pitching people forward in urgent messianic expectation, Orthodox practice opens up the realm of the eternal as a means by which people can situate themselves in the present. Through living right in this world, one can glimpse God's eternity now, and so the symbolic weight of the future is diminished. And when the present seems to be filled with injustice, one can remind oneself that it is, after all, the fallen temporal world. This is certainly not to suggest that Vernici inhabit a parallel dimension abstracted from real life. Rather, through reference to eternity, they lend coherence to the temporal order, reminding themselves that this is indeed the world and that there is a more beautiful one beyond it. Thank you.